Okay, hello everyone. My name is Deric Roosma. I'm the education coordinator. I'm here with Isa, the political activities coordinator, and I'm here with Ardi Bouwers. Ardi, welcome. Well, welcome because we're in your place, but nice to have you here. I know Ardi from my honors class. It's a class about China, the rising power, which talks about China in the 21st century, and obviously about the rise to power and all the things that come with it. Furthermore, Ardi is also a teacher, a lecturer at Shanghai. Am I pronouncing it right?
In Guangzhou, Jinan University.
Oh, Guangzhou University, and she teaches about journalism. Other than that, she's also the founder, I believe, of the China Circle, which gives advice to companies about media in China, I should say. And other than that, she also has a broad knowledge about journalism. So, Ardi, first question for you. Where did your fascination start for China?
Well, I was interested in cultures, in cultures from far away from the Netherlands and Europe. China was a very sort of exotic and strange place to me. And when I had to decide what to study in university, somehow China was attractive, and I thought, well, why not? Let's just try. This was in 1979, so a long time ago. I thought, well, let's just try. And if I don't like it, I can always decide to study something completely different. I can always study law or economics or something else. So I just started it and liked it. I think one of my inspirations about China was a detective novel. Judge D. Robert van Gulik, who was a former diplomat, he also wrote these Judge D novels. And they were great. This was about China in the Tang Dynasty. And there was this judge, a very sort of honorable judge who, and really strange things happening. And he was sort of moving around in this Tang Dynasty China. I thought that was very interesting. But during my studies, I was interested in ancient China philosophy, and I learned how to read Confucius in ancient Chinese, etc., etc. But the moment I set foot on in mainland China, I never looked back again. I just was interested in the People's Republic of China. Its politics, its economy, but especially also its society. So a very sort of old focus at first, but a complete turnaround later on.
Okay, yes. So you studied sinology, if I'm correct?
Yes, Chinese language and culture.
Okay, and you said that you studied Confucianism texts in ancient Chinese. Mm-hmm. You also speak Chinese, right?
Yes, I do.
Could you maybe give an example for us?
你们好，欢迎你们，真的很好，欢迎你们在这里。
Okay, I believe that was Chinese.
Very welcome to you too. I'm really happy that you're here.
Okay, 谢谢. Thank you.
Yeah, so currently English is the third most spoken language in the world. Next to that, it's Spanish, and with a whopping 980 million people, Chinese is on the first place. Do you think that Chinese will be the next global language?
I honestly, I don't think so. I think the Chinese language is quite difficult and complex and difficult to learn. So if you're focusing on China, then Chinese is very important. But if you're not focusing on China, then it just takes too much time and energy to study it. So I think large groups of people in the world are never going to learn Chinese. But once you have contact with China or Chinese, it's getting more and more. It's becoming more and more an obligation to learn Chinese. So, like 20 years ago, you could go to China as a foreigner and work at a company and not speak Chinese. And now, if you want to get a job in China, they want you to have HSK level 5 or whatever. So they want you to really put an effort into learning Chinese.
So do you think that in the future, diplomats will, like the first language they will talk with each other is So do you think that in the future diplomats will speak Chinese with each other, or will it stick to English?
I think there will be so now there's English and Spanish and French. I mean, there are a couple of international languages or languages that are used in international fora. I think Chinese can be added to that. And I really, really think it's very important for the Dutch diplomats, for instance, to have quite a substantial number who can speak the language or at least understand the language and know a lot about the culture, because China is so big and important. I really think we here in the Netherlands should know a lot more about it. But I can't imagine that Chinese is going to be the diplomatic language, to be honest.
Okay. Yes. So we had a question sent in by one of our students, Flores. He claimed that there was recently a book published which mentioned the tensions between the inward cities, the more rural cities, and the tension between the more capitalistical coastal cities. Could you elaborate if there is actually a tension, and do you think this might escalate due to more dangerous situations, so to say?
Yes, this is an important subject. So we tend to see China as one whole, whereas there are lots of contradictions within China and many different parts with all different sets of rules. And one of the really most important contradictions is the one between the richer coastal areas that are a lot more developed and the much poorer interior of China. And what we've seen over the past 2-3 decades is that hundreds of millions of poor people from the countryside have moved into cities, not to become really inhabitants of cities, but to work in factories there. So it's sort of an underclass, and they don't have the same rights as the original city people. It's called the floating population. So these are like 300 to 400 million people who don't have access to healthcare, to schools, to all sorts of other things in the cities. So who are sort of second-class citizens, but who do a lot of the work. And what you do see quite a few, especially at factories, you see people, workers who are not content and who strike or who complain or who organize every now and then as well. So this is the authorities in Beijing really work hard not to let it get out of hand. So they're aware of this, and they want everyone to keep as quiet and sociable as possible. But this really is a problem. So it could at some point, if their situation becomes even worse than it is now, or if the gap between the rural poor and the urban rich becomes even bigger, then this might really pose problems.
Okay, yes. You also talked about the people who come from the inwards country, from the countryside towards the cities, not having the same rights, let's say. China is still officially communist, right? The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is a communist party. So you would think that they try to provide basic services to everybody, right? So is it that they are not offered these services, or is it that they cannot afford these, for example, or health services?
They are offered these services if they stay in the countryside. So they have access to healthcare, they have access to schools in their own original villages and towns. But once they move to Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou, then they lose those rights, because access to these facilities is tied to your hukou, and your hukou is where you're officially registered. So it's a way, it's sort of a policy where the government tries to control more or less the flow of population within China.
Okay, yeah.
Wow. We as Westerns often have a probably distorted view of the Chinese people and China itself. Could you maybe give an insight into how the Chinese look at Western people or the civilization, And does that view of the government equal the view of the people towards the West?
Yeah, this is changing over time, of course. The first time I came to China was in the early 1980s. And there were not many Western people at all. So I was sort of a very strange person. And they, especially in the countryside where they never saw Westerners, they tried to touch me and felt my skin and so I was like really, really strange. Well, over the decades that has changed, especially in the cities. Like in Shanghai, so many white and black and all sorts of faces that it's not so strange anymore. So the more access to people from other places in China, the more people get used to it. What I've noticed over the past, say, 10 years, Chinese are usually, a lot of people in China are very interested in what's happening in the West. A lot of Chinese young people want to study in the West, so study in the US or in Europe. But over the past couple of years, what you see is a growing tendency of pride about China itself and of nationalist feelings. And the state media really work hard on stimulating that as well. So if I look at the state media at this time, you see a lot of how bad the West is doing, especially America with the US-China trade war and tech war. There's a lot of look at how the US can't cope with the COVID-19 crisis, and look how well we've managed to do so. So Chinese official media really paint a picture at this time of we in China are very successful. We've almost gotten rid of real poverty. We've been working hard on that, and the West and all those democracies are in a mess. So, and then they point to the US and US elections, they point to COVID-19, they point to Brexit. And they say, well, is this what your perfect Western system is like? Well, if it is, then we're not interested. And quite a few people in China are susceptible to that. So over the years, you see an increase, I hear an increasing number of people who are convinced that the Chinese system is better for China and they don't need another system.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, when I think of China, I automatically think about an authoritarian state with a lot of authoritarian measures. And sometimes even reminds me of the book from George Orwell, 1984, if I see about all the CCTV cameras that are placed in cities where there's face recognition, stuff like that. What really shocked me was when I heard about the social credit system. I was wondering if you could maybe briefly explain what the social credit system is, and if you could tell us how the Chinese people view this, if this is working, or if there's any great benefits to it.
Yeah, a social credit system was sort of set up originally because China was quite advanced in e-commerce. And when you order stuff online, you don't, as a customer, you want to be sure that the person where you send money to for goods is reliable, and vice versa. If you sell goods, you don't want to send it off without knowing for sure that your client is reliable. And there was nothing within China to guarantee that. And China is quite a low trust society, so people didn't trust each other. So a little bit like with Airbnb and many Western platforms as well, they set up this system where a client grades the seller, and where the seller grades the client. And this sort of made it possible for e-commerce to really take off, and it took off in an incredible way. The Chinese buy way more online. The whole online e-commerce environment is much more advanced, and much faster than what we have here. So that's the origin of it. If you combine credit worthiness of customers, and if you, as a company, you also give access to the authorities to the same information, and you combine that with all sorts of other information, you get something that feels scary to a lot of us. Because it shows, well, have you speeded in your car? Have you ever been expelled from school? Have you
jaywalked, right?
Yeah, well, so any jaywalking is one example. Have you ever there's a red light and you're across the street anyway? So all of that could be sort of put into the same system. Now, so this whole idea of putting it all in the system and seeing China as one really big, very advanced system is scary. And that idea is really scary, but in reality, that's not how the system works at this time. So there are all sorts of trials of this social credit system, where some is very much based still on e-commerce, where some local authorities have combined it with other data. But it's not the case yet that all these systems are combined on a national level. And that if you have a bad credit score, then you will be picked out of a large group of people everywhere. One thing that I usually show to my students here in the Netherlands or in other places as well is an advertisement for 5G technology for China Mobile, I think it is. And they have this ad where they show how the Chinese system works really well in accessing all these data, putting it together, in finding criminals. That it's an ad. And if I show it to my students, they say, wow, this really is dystopian. This is like 1984. Mm-hmm. Whereas the fact that it's an ad proves that Chinese people like it. So the idea for most, the response of most Chinese about these systems is that it gives them a sense of security. So they imagine that if you have a basket of apples and there's one rotten apple, then it's best if the government takes out that rotten apple to take good care of the rest. So it's for the sake of the rest of society that they do this. And I think a large majority of Chinese really feel that way, really feel that it helps for their sense of security for themselves and their parents and their children. And that's a completely different way of us looking at it.
Yeah, definitely, because at the classes you give, we're constantly confronted with this contrast of our vision of China and the Chinese vision of China. So to hear about the social credit system, for example, that it has not been implemented everywhere yet, is kind of eye-opening, because we always get the image from, okay, they have the social credit system, it's bad, it's already taking away so many rights of people. But if there's consent, so to say, by the Chinese people, it's really eye-opening that most of these things are not that bad, so to say.
Yeah, or it's viewed as something beneficial.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's important to not sort of put our ideas on China, because we tend to have preconceptions, and then whatever we see, we sort of interpret it in that particular way. Whereas I think it's important to also look at it from another perspective.
Considering censorship, is there a way for the Chinese to discuss politics or their disapproval with each other? I know that Deric sometimes mentioned a way of communicating via social media with certain characters. Could you maybe give more
What's interesting about the way Chinese communicate, and what's very different from the way most people, especially in the Netherlands, but mainly in Western countries, communicate, is that Chinese people communicate in a much more layered way. Much more, we sort of tend to say, well, this is the way it is, and this is my opinion, and if you don't agree, we're going to have a discussion. Chinese are much more used to reading between the lines, so all sorts of hidden messages they pick up on. Whereas for a Dutch audience, I would have to sort of spell it out and then people would pick it up. So what happens, for instance, if, something like the Me Too campaign became really big in the US and then Europe. And of course, there's a lot of sexual harassment in China as well. So Chinese women started to pick up on that as well and started to share their stories. Well, the hashtag Me Too in English was immediately banned because that was not what the authorities wanted people to talk about. So they switched the hashtag. And then at some point they started to use sounds that in Chinese that sound like Me Too, and the Me means a bowl of rice, and Tu means a rabbit. So they used the pictures of a bowl of rice and a rabbit with a hashtag. And then it takes a while for the authorities to find out that that means Me Too as well and for it to ban. But then the stories have spread a lot already. And the same happened, for instance, around Tiananmen 1989, the protests. June 4th, 1989 was, well, this is the protest, and they were really very harshly suppressed with hundreds or maybe thousands of dead. So that is the sort of information that is not, the authorities don't like you to share. In Chinese, the June 4th is 6/4, 6-month 4th day. So it became 6/4, well, immediately that was suppressed as well. So at some point, people look for other ways of saying the same thing. So either they use pictures and then spread the word, but at some point, something like the 31st, May 35th or something became what they shared, and that is then, if you say May 35th, is the same as June 4th. So they're very, very creative in pictures and in words and in hashtags. And in that way they, because people are so used to reading between the lines, lots of people know what the intentions are.
Yeah, wow. Democratic European governments are not fully transparent, but we can get somewhat of a glimpse of the inner workings about, for example, who has the real power in their hands. How does this look inside the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party? Is there an authoritarian rule by Xi Jinping, if I pronounce it right? Mm-hmm. And does he have checks and balances from within the party? Can anyone even look inside?
Very, very difficult. So some people call this reading tea leaves, trying to understand what's happening at the top of the Beijing leadership. Usually what's happening at this time, we just don't know. So you sort of look at all sorts of signals and try to combine them and then draw a conclusion very carefully. It seems that Xi Jinping, the number one leader, really is in control at the moment. Former leaders, after Mao Zedong was sort of the number one leader as well for a long time, between 1949 and his death in 1976. And since then, Chinese leadership was collective. So it was a group of 7 or 9, always men, who were the top leadership. And then another layer of 25 people who sort of supported those, and then, so very layered. But since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, so 8 years ago, he really has controlled a lot, and where before Xi Jinping usually the General Secretary of the Communist Party was responsible for all sorts of political and social issues. The Prime Minister was usually responsible for the economy. Xi Jinping, the moment he came to power, also decided that he was going to chair the most important economic meetings and committees. He also became immediately the leader of the Central Military Commission. So all the vital positions are in the hands of Xi Jinping himself, and that gives all of us at least an impression that he really is in power. And then you can also look at who else is being appointed in different positions, and it makes sense to then look at how these relationships are. Are these people Xi Jinping used to work with in his former career? Are these friends of Xi Jinping, or are they from other areas? Well, a lot of Xi Jinping people are being appointed, have been appointed over the years.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to say what exactly is happening, and we always sort of know what has been happening only a couple of years later, I'm afraid.
So you have broad experience and knowledge in journalism, and I was curious about what journalism looks like in China. There's obviously a high degree of censorship. So how true is the profession of journalism there? Is it compared to art image of journalism? Or,
No, well, the official task of journalists is to present China in a positive light. And that's a completely different thing to Western journalists. So Western journalists look at what's happening and try to well, it's sort of a part of the democracy as well, where the government says and does certain things, and it's up to media to check and maybe bring to light injustice, etc., etc. In China, the journalist's official task is, make sure that the world knows and how well China is doing. And this, especially also, again, since Xi Jinping, really has become much more mandatory than in the past. So it has become much more difficult for Chinese journalists to really do investigative journalism. But there still are journalists who do so. So there are some very, very brave people who delve into stories and miscarriage of justice or whatever, and bring that to light. It has been a bit easier for journalists about 10 to 15 years ago. You could really see that there were some journalist magazines that tried to push the envelope at the time. Now it's getting more difficult. But if you want to work within the system and still, because most Chinese journalists still want to improve people's lives, basically, want to look at injustice and try to help solve that. So if I teach journalism at a Chinese university in the south of China, and the subjects they come up with are about child labor and forced marriages, or women being kidnapped in Vietnam and brought into China because there are not enough women to marry men. So all things and about corruption, environmental issues, etc., etc. So the subjects are the same. It's just that the way that the space that they have to actually really delve into these subjects is a bit more limited. But I think if you look at international media, there are quite a few correspondents from international media in China. I would dare to say that most of the important scoops from international media have been prepared by Chinese assistants. So a lot of the information still comes through Chinese, but it's quite difficult for them to work. A way to work within the Chinese system is to look at what the leaders say is important. So if there is a big anti-corruption campaign, then it's okay within certain boundaries to delve into corruption stories. The environment is a big concern in China. So all sorts of environmental issues, you can really bring the problems to light without ending up in jail, basically. So you have to choose your subjects carefully.
So you also briefly touched upon when you were discussing the Chinese Communist Party, that there were mostly or almost only men. I can remember like pictures of the Great Hall with all the communist parties, and then you see like 12 females sitting there. He also talked about women being kidnapped from Vietnam because there's a shortage of, I'd say a shortage of women. It sounds really weird to say that. And you obviously also had for a long time, the one-child policy, which I also heard terrible stories from, where they had multiple children, and then one boy and one girl. If you only have one, if you only can have one child, who are you going to pick? So it's these terrible stories. I'm really curious, what is the position of women in Chinese society? Obviously, the entire world is going through changes right now. So I was wondering, is the position of women better compared to the last decades, or hasn't it really changed?
Well, position in China when there were still emperors was really, really bad. You had to be very submissive as a woman. In under communism, the position of women really improved. So Mao Zedong said, well, women hold up half of the sky, so they're really important. And the first law after setting up the People's Republic of China in 1949 was the marriage law. And the marriage law was there to protect rights of women within marriage. Those were really, really big changes from the feudal society with not a very good position for women at all, to 1949 and the realization that women were important, not just in agriculture, but also in industry, etc., etc. Now, if you look at current China, I would say, so politics, it's very difficult for women to reach the top. So the top 7, all men. Then there is a layer of 25, and there's one woman there. And then, so in politics it's very difficult, but in ordinary life, and especially in business, I would say the position of women might be even better in China than it is in the Netherlands. So there are lots, it's very normal to work, and women do not work part-time, but work full-time, have very good careers, are very successful. So if you have business meetings or also government meetings, then it's like 50-50 man-woman. And the women are very effective, efficient, and work very well. So it's just in politics that you see that the position of women is not very good.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for those insights. So we already talked about briefly before this interview about that we might be scared that you cannot say certain things, stuff like that. I was also wondering, since you're also a lecturer in China, this is probably from my ignorance because we see China as this very authoritarian state. Did you get, for example, a letter from the Ministry of Internal Affairs or something with a list? These are things you can say, these are things you can't say. Is there somebody constantly shadowing you, following you around, anything like that?
No, I started teaching about 5 years ago, so I've been teaching at Jinan University in Guangzhou and also at Xiamen University. What we discussed was what I was going to teach, and then I could sort of teach all sorts of general stuff about journalism or about intercultural communication, which is a little bit safer, it's not as political. But then they requested me to teach international news comparison and analysis. So that was their choice. So in my classes over the past couple of years, I've been sort of looking at international developments and then look at how the Chinese media have been reporting on it and the international. And both in Xiamen and in Guangzhou, I could teach what I wanted to teach, but in Xiamen, at the end of the course, they wanted to see my PowerPoint presentations. In Guangzhou, they never asked. But over the years, things changed a little bit. So I think 3 years ago, in every single classroom, a camera was installed. And that is very much how the system works. So is somebody shadowing me? No, people are not shadowing me, I think. But with this camera, you never know whether people are going to watch or not, which is the same as, so censorship can be bad, but what's even more effective is self-censorship. That's the same with the camera. If this camera is there, I'm convinced that they're not watching for 99% of the time, because there are 200 classrooms and they're not going to look at all these 200 classrooms at the same time. But the fact that it's there means that I'm aware of it, but also my students are aware of it. So I've had occasions where a student asked a question about Tiananmen, for instance, which is a non-subject. And then one of my students sort of pointed over his shoulder to the camera and said, well, maybe better not. And then for me, I can decide whether I want to discuss it or not. For me, it's quite easy to discuss it. For my students, it might be more of a problem.
Okay. Sounds scary. Also very effective in a way, I guess, as well. Yes, Isa.
About the topic China as a rising power, are there any special benefits that the Chinese political system has compared to the democratic system, political system, in regards to effectively governing?
Well, what they say themselves is democracy is very messy, and we in China have a meritocracy. So we are governed by the best and brightest. And we choose those best and brightest through a very severe, harsh vetting system within the Communist Party. So any Chinese leader who arrives at the top, 25, will probably have been in charge of a city of 20 million people or a province of 80 or 100 million people. So our people, is what they say, have a lot of experience of being in charge of quite large groups of people and also whole provinces. And the fact that you don't have elections all the time means that you don't have to, you can sort of in your, as sort of a wise father of the nation, you can take the best decisions for the whole population. So that's the thinking. And there is there are a couple of aspects to it that to me ring true as well. China is incredibly big. I mean, 1.4 billion people is a lot. There are many cities there are many cities that I don't even know the names of, over 1 million. So a city of 1 million inhabitants is not considered very big. So the large cities are over 10 million. So it's big and it's complex. So how do you govern that? They say, well, we can only govern such a complex society by being autocratic, by ruling from Beijing with the best and brightest. There might be something to say to that. What I have been, I think we tend to put too much stress on the value of democracy. And there are many kinds of democracy. So one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote is a form of democracy, but you have the US democracy, to me, is very messy as well, where lots of people don't have access to voting. Looking at Brexit, to me, where 51% of the population decided on something very, very important, and 49% of the population's opinion was just shoved aside, feels, to me, not very just.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many different types of democracies, and even in some Western democracies, the system does not appeal to me. Yes, I think looking at China and talking to many Chinese people over the years, most Chinese people do not really think that democracy is the one goal to achieve. The thing a lot of Chinese people do stress is justice. So if we keep saying, well, democracy is the most important, then you're not going to find many people in China who say, oh, yes, indeed. I mean, there are some, but not many. If you talk about justice, then a lot of Chinese people can relate to that. So I think if you look at our system, then rule of law is maybe a better access point to discuss benefits of our system, for instance, than just hammer on democracy. So if you talk about rule of law and the fact that all people should have equal access and etc., then that is something that a lot of Chinese can relate to. Whereas if you just say, well, democracy, then they, well, I think by now, especially with the American elections, just laugh you in the face.
Okay. So moving on, I'm not sure if I speak for many Westerners, but I certainly feel this way myself. People are obviously usually afraid of change. And we're also, well, I am a bit afraid of the ideals of China in general. So having China as this rising power that will probably take over, or has already taken over, the USA as a superpower, people might get afraid that China might get too involved in their usual lives. Do you think that it is grounded to think that China might influence our lives and our Western ideals that much through ways of espionage, or maybe even, for example, territorial expansion?
I think China is mainly concerned with China itself, much more with China itself than with the outside world. So for China, politics, international politics are less important than Chinese national politics. But China really feels that it has the right to the top position. And China feels that it has been the leading economy in the world for centuries. And there was this intermezzo of American superpower, but now China is sort of stepping back on its on the stage, and that's its rightful place. In this whole idea of wanting to become the number one, not just in the economic field, but also militarily and technologically. There are, it's very likely and possible, and it's happening, is that technology, for instance, can be stolen from others. So if you look at not just from companies, but also sometimes all sorts of research and development, both militarily, non-militarily. This goal of becoming the greatest sort of makes it okay, and makes all sorts of means to attain that goal okay from a Chinese point of view. So if it is in the Chinese interest to obtain a certain technology, they will not necessarily play by very nice rules, would be my thinking. If you look at are they going to sort of take over large parts of the world, Chinese propaganda has been that they won't. They always say we've never been expansionist, and that is not true. So if you look at a map of Han China around the year 0 or just 200 before Christ, and you look at Tang China, you look at Ming China, you look at Qing China, well, there China was from small, a bit bigger, even bigger, and Qing dynasty China, that was the last empire, was a really, really big territory. So they have expanded, and what they now try, so they try in their narrative to say somehow that they've never been invading anybody, whereas that is not true. That said, I just looking at where they might want to expand to, you see all sorts of stuff happening on the China-India border.
The Chinese Sea as well, right?
Yeah, the South China Sea, and you see, and there's Taiwan, of course. So I would not say that China would never expand, but at some point you need to also decide where you want to do your battles and where not. One of the things that, so the South China Sea, you can see that China has changed the maps over the years and has sort of put a 9-dash line around some, well, not even islands, and they've been building islands with small flight strips and small harbors as well to show, well, this is Chinese territory and that's why we have the right to a lot of territory around it as well. So that is something where they have been working for a long time already to show, well, this is Chinese territory. We're not expanding, but this has always been the case, which is not true. And for Taiwan, that has been a story where in 1949 there were the communists versus the nationalists. The communists and the Mao Zedong won. The nationalists fled to Taiwan. And for a couple of decades after 1949, the nationalists in Taiwan wanted to reconquer the mainland. So both agreed that Taiwan and mainland China were one. Now, over the past couple of decades in Taiwan, Taiwan has become a parliamentary democracy, and they've changed quite a bit. So now, and there are other parties than just the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and they don't want reunification with China. So now one of the big questions is where if Taiwan would want to be a separate entity or even a separate country, what's China going to do? And listening to Xi Jinping and looking at the way China has been dealing with Hong Kong and the return of Hong Kong to the motherland, I would expect China to be quite aggressive towards Taiwan. So a year ago, I wouldn't have thought China might really even use military means. Now that has become a possibility. So things are moving.
Okay. Yeah. I think you, how do you say that, made some fears disappear for me. That China's not really focused on the international, so to say. And I really like that you keep teaching us about the Chinese perspective as well. There's still one fear I have, and maybe some people are thinking as well. Are you a Chinese spy sent by the government?
Am I a spy?
Yeah.
Well, I would never say so if I were. But I don't think the Chinese government likes what I say and what I teach so much. So I would, if you want to know whether people are spies, it's good to look at their actions. I am not very close to the Chinese embassy here in The Hague, and never invited to the 1st of October celebrations. So maybe that's all just my scheming.
Yeah, maybe,
But
no.
you never know. Yeah.
Chinese are smart, so yeah. Okay, that convinces me, I guess.
Yeah. Moving to another important topic, some say China is looking more and more like North Korea. You have Xi Jinping, who is taking this central role in the government, which might look like the position as a supreme leader. And there's also camps where Uyghurs are put in, and these might be similar to camps in North Korea. And there's obviously also in North Korea, like in North Korea, a certain degree of censorship. Is it a fair comparison to compare China to North Korea?
I would call China autocratic. North Korea, well, maybe autocratic to the max. North Korea is much smaller, so I just looking at the Chinese political system, it's very centrally organized. It's autocratic, and there's no democracy. There is a one-party rule. There are a couple of other political parties don't have much influence. I think a big difference. The reason for camps in North Korea is very different from China. Reason for camps in North Korea, there are work camps for all sorts, and lots of people who think differently are in those camps, as far as I know, because I'm not a specialist on that. Looking at the camps in Xinjiang, in the western part of China, these are, according to the United Nations, almost about 1 million people in those camps, so an incredible amount. And all of them are Muslims and people from the Uyghur minority. And it seems, so looking at the reason for those camps, I would look at Chinese reasons, and that's not comparable to North Korea in my view. It looks like the leadership in Beijing wants to, and that's an old word, to sinicize all its minorities. And to sinicize is to make them Chinese, make them act like Chinese. And they have been doing that for a long time with the Tibetans as well. And they are now, there are discussions in Inner Mongolia, where there cannot be any school in the local language anymore. So really eradicating aspects of local culture in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Inner Mongolia and in other places. Looking at Xinjiang, it looks like China really wants to change the way of life of a very large minority group. No Qurans anymore, no greetings in Arabic, no beards anymore. People have to start to eat pork, might be sort of seduced or forced to drink alcohol. So what they basically are trying is to force the Han Chinese way of life onto an entire population.
Yeah.
And as that population does not really want that, they've been doing it with a lot of force. And they do so under the guise of saying, well, these are desperately poor people, they don't have skills, and we are going to give them skills to take better care of themselves.
Yeah.
And that's happening in Xinjiang. That has been happening in Tibet earlier as well. So if you ask an average Chinese person what they think of what has been happening in Tibet and is happening now in Xinjiang, they will probably say, well, these were sort of feudal societies, very old-fashioned, very poor people, and we helped them to work in factories or to bake bread or to make whatever, to produce, and we helped them to become richer and have better lives.
Yeah.
And that is being taught in schools. So talking to most people in China, also students, if you've always learned in school that this is sort of a civilization campaign for the good of those people, then it's very difficult for people who've been born and raised in China to know what's going on if the Chinese media are not open about it.
Yeah. If I speak for myself, this is a terrible problem that people are being put in camps. But if we look at the action taken by governments all over the world, not that many countries actually take action. Is there a specific reason why we do not act upon this problem?
Well, one of the things that has to do with China's size and China's influence, I think. And one of the things a lot of people are waiting for is for the Muslim world to take action. And the Muslim world is really, really silent on this. And I'm convinced that if people from Muslim countries would do a lot more, then that would spread to other countries as well. But it's difficult if the whole Muslim world keeps mum about it to then from Amsterdam or Paris or somewhere else take the initiative. So that's not an excuse, but it's very that makes the fact that China has had lots of connections with many Muslim countries and Pakistan, for instance, but also in Central Asia. Somehow led to the fact that they are not saying that this is inexcusable or a human rights violation or whatever words they will want to use. And the fact that that the Muslim world does not do it makes it even harder for the West to be very effective there.
Okay. So yeah, obviously the Uyghurs is a topic that it speaks to many, that really gets the emotions high for many people.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that really hit me was also the situation of Hong Kong, seeing the protesters acting peacefully against Chinese government that is using violence and oppression to really pin them down. I was wondering, does Hong Kong stand a chance against China, against the so to say, incorporation into China? So how is that a chance? And is it even, does China even need to be careful with handling Hong Kong?
China has not been very careful with handling Hong Kong. It has been careful a long time ago, but recently not anymore. So if you look at the national security law that was imposed on the 1st of July of this year, so a couple of months ago, that was really Beijing deciding that they had enough. They did not want any demonstrations anymore. They did not want. They wanted to be in full control of government, of the local government in Hong Kong. And that was decided overnight and imposed on Hong Kong. No involvement or consultation of the Hong Kong population at all. So if you look at that, there's not much the Hong Kong population can do now because they decided to do so and apparently concluded that it was okay to do so. Now, if you look at Hong Kong from an international law perspective, Then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping talked and concluded that Britain, the old colonial power, was going to give Hong Kong back. And a lot of territory of Hong Kong had been leased to Britain for a long time. And only Hong Kong Island itself was really property of the colonial British Empire. But even so, they decided that Hong Kong would become part of China again. And they decided there would be a 50 year period where they could get used to each other, and Hong Kong could sort of maybe slowly change into China's direction. And China, and I really remember Deng Xiaoping saying so, would probably also change a little bit into Hong Kong's direction. So both would sort of grow a little bit more alike. The idea was from 1997 onwards, when Hong Kong was formally handed back to China, that Hong Kong would stay in a sort of independent territory, and only its defense and foreign policy would be in the hands of Beijing. Now, with the national security law in July of this year, that completely turned around, because everything now is in the hands of Beijing. And I don't, to say it in a not very subtle way, in my opinion, Hong Kong has overnight turned into just another Chinese city.
Sad to hear, I guess, from the Western perspective.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ardi, for sharing your insights on China. We often get taught about China that it's going to become a rising power. It's also nice to have some insight on what it actually means and what China really is about. So thank you for taking the time. If anybody is considering doing the honors classes, I highly recommend joining Ardi's class, China the Rising Power. It gives you great insights about China in general, but also the Chinese perspective. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your questions and your curiosity, because I think that's what's really important. It's whether you like China or do not like China, I don't care really, but I really think we should be much more curious about what's happening in that very important country.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.